I always thought Sarah and I had something solid. 12 years in that little house on Maple Street, with its creaky porch and the oak tree out front, felt like a life well built. I'd wake up at 6:30, brew coffee, and she'd shuffle in with that sleepy smile, her auburn hair a mess. We'd eat dinner together most nights. Nothing fancy, just pasta or chicken. And sometimes we'd watch old movies, her feet tucked under my legs on the couch. I'm a software engineer, steady and logical, and she's an illustrator, freelancing for magazines and kids' books. To me, it was enough. To the neighbors, we were the picture of ordinary happiness. But looking back, I see the cracks I ignored. Started small. Sarah stopped sketching at the kitchen table, claiming she needed fresh air for inspiration. She'd disappear for hours, coming back with vague excuses. Parks, coffee shops, a friend's house. I trusted her. Why wouldn't I? Then there was the smell. This faint, musty whiff, like old attics or antique shops, clinging to her clothes. Where've you been? I'd ask, casual, not wanting to push. Oh, just wandering, she'd say, brushing it off with a laugh. But it gnawed at me. One night, I found a receipt in her purse. Some costume shop downtown, $30 for a Victorian lace trim. She didn't dress up for me, so what was it for? I let it sit, a splinter in my mind, and told myself I was overthinking. Then there was Harold, our next-door neighbor, this wiry old man pushing 74, with a face like crumpled paper and a house full of weirdness. I'd see him on his porch, waving at us with that crooked grin, surrounded by his collection of stuffed animals. Not toys, but the real kind, preserved with glass eyes. A fox on his steps, a hawk on a shelf by the window. Creepy, sure, but harmless, I thought. Sarah started waving back more often, lingering by the fence to chat. He's quirky, she'd say, grinning like it was some private joke. I didn't mind at first, let her have her oddball friend. But then she started going over there. He's showing me his new peacock, she'd tell me, breezing out the door. I'd nod, pretending it didn't bother me. But it did. Something was shifting, and I couldn't name it yet. Weeks passed, and the signs piled up. She'd come home flushed, her eyes bright in a way I hadn't seen in years, her fingers stained with ink or dust I couldn't place. She'd hum these old tunes, Victorian parlor songs, I later learned, while cooking, like she was lost in some other world. I asked her once, point blank, "What's going on with you and Harold?" She laughed, too quick, and said, "He's just lonely, Mark. I'm being nice." But nice doesn't explain the silk scarf I found in her coat pocket, or the way she flinched when I hugged her, like my touch was an intrusion. I started watching closer. The splinter became a blade, cutting deeper each day, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. My wife was slipping away, and I needed to know why. I'm not a suspicious man by nature. I fix problems with code, logic, patterns, solutions. But this wasn't a program I could debug. So I improvised. I bought a cheap security camera, told Sarah it was for break-ins. Maple Street was safe, but she didn't question it. I set it up in the living room, angled toward the back door she liked to use. 3 days later, I had my first clue. The footage showed her slipping out at dusk, her hair pinned up like some vintage doll, a shawl around her shoulders. She glanced back once, then vanished into the twilight. My stomach churned. Where was she going? I followed her the next time. It was a Tuesday, humid and still. She left after dinner, claiming she needed to clear her head. I waited 5 minutes, then trailed her, keeping to the shadows. She went straight to Harold's place, her steps quick, eager, even. I crouched in his overgrown yard, peering through a grimy window. What I saw froze me. Sarah stood in his parlor, wearing this moth-eaten gown, laced up tight, like something from a museum. Harold was there, adjusting a stuffed owl on a perch, his bony hands trembling as he grinned at her. She laughed, twirling for him, and then he touched her, his fingers grazing her arm, then her waist. It wasn't innocent. It was intimate, deliberate. My chest tightened like a vice. I needed more. I hacked her phone that night. She never changed her password from our wedding date. Her texts with Harold were coded, theatrical nonsense. The heiress awaits her suitor tonight, or bring the velvet cloak. It was a game, a twisted little play they were acting out. I went back to Harold's the next evening, hiding again, and saw the full scene. She was in a corset now, her hair loose, straddling him on this dusty chaise lounge while those dead animals stared from the walls. He whispered something, his voice low and raspy, and she leaned into him, her hands on his shoulders. It wasn't just betrayal. It was grotesque, bizarre. Like she'd stepped into some warped fantasy I couldn't comprehend. My wife, my Sarah, with that old man and his lifeless menagerie. The rage came slow, building like a storm. I didn't confront her. I couldn't yet. I needed to understand the depth of it to fuel what came next. I dug into Harold's life. Public records showed he'd been tangled in a fraud case years back, slinking away unscathed. Tax filings hinted at more undeclared income offshore accounts. He wasn't just a creepy widower. He had money, real money, and I found withdrawals in Sarah's bank app. Small sums that matched his gifts. A brooch here, a scarf there. She wasn't just playing his game. She was taking his bribes. My mind spun with it, the hurt morphing into something colder, sharper. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I planned. If she wanted to throw our life away for this, I'd make sure she lost everything. Revenge isn't loud, it's quiet, methodical. I started with Harold. I hired a private investigator, fed him every scrap I'd found. The fraud rumors, the hidden accounts, the tax evasions. I made an anonymous call to the IRS, posing as a concerned citizen who'd overheard Harold bragging about stuffing cash in his animals. Took weeks, but they bit. One morning, I watched from our porch as agents swarmed his house. They tore through it, hauling out his precious collection. Foxes, birds, that peacock. Cracking them open to find wads of bills hidden inside. Harold stood there, frail and shouting, until they cuffed him and dragged him away. Sarah ran out, pale as a ghost, staring as her secret world crumbled. I played dumb. What's all this about? I asked, my voice flat. She didn't answer, just trembled. Next was her. I'd already started unraveling her life, subtle at first. I swapped her sketching pencils with cheap ones that snapped, corrupted her laptop files so her clients got gibberish. Small cuts to bleed her confidence. I left mothballs in her drawers, under her pillow, letting that smell haunt her like it haunted me. She'd jump at shadows, muttering about bad luck. But Harold kept her hooked until the raid. After that, I went public. I'd snapped blurry photos during my stakeouts. Sarah in that corset, Harold's hands on her. I sent them to a local gossip site, no name attached. Within hours, the street was buzzing. The illustrator and the taxidermy freak. Her phone lit up with cancellations. Friends ghosting her. Neighbors sneering. She came to me, sobbing, begging me to believe it was a mistake. I looked through her, said nothing, and let her drown in it. The end was surgical. I filed for divorce, but first, I drained our accounts. Every cent moved to a trust she'd never touch. I sold the house, quick and quiet, leaving her with a lease termination notice and a suitcase. She had nowhere to go but a cheap motel across town. For the final twist, I called in a favor from a buddy at the evidence locker. Harold's seized collection, those glassy-eyed beasts, was accidentally shipped to her new address. Dozens of boxes arrived, unannounced, and I heard later she opened them alone, screaming as the neighbors peeked out. She was broke, shunned, surrounded by the wreckage of her choices. Harold rotted in jail, his fortune gone, his health fading. I moved to Portland, started over, kept one photo, her in that corset, as a trophy of what I'd done. Looking back, I don't feel guilt. She didn't just betray me. She turned our life into some sick theater with that old man, chasing his trinkets and his twisted games. I gave her what she deserved, not a shout or a scene, but a slow, cruel dismantling. Maple Street forgot us eventually, but I'll never forget how I took back what was mine, piece by brutal piece. After the raid on Harold's place and the gossip site leak, I watched Sarah crumble from a distance, but I wasn't done. Revenge, I learned, isn't a single blow. It's a process, like stripping paint from wood, layer by layer until there's nothing left. She still lived in our house then, though I'd already started the sale behind her back. She'd come home from her motel shifts, some dead-end job she'd picked up after her clients bailed, and I'd see her through the blinds, pacing, muttering to herself. The mothballs I'd hidden were working. She'd sniff the air, check her clothes, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. I'd planted more, under the couch in the vents, knowing that smell tied her to Harold, to what she'd done. It was petty, maybe, but it felt right. I upped the stakes. She'd always been proud of her art, her little illustrations of rabbits and flowers that magazines loved. So I hit her there. I kept a spare key to her laptop bag, and one night, while she slept, I slipped in and uploaded a virus I'd coded. Nothing flashy, just enough to scramble her files. The next morning, she called me in a panic, voice shaking. "Mark, my portfolio's gone. Everything's corrupted." I drove over, played the concerned husband, poked at her screen while she hovered behind me. "Weird," I said, shrugging. "Maybe it's old hardware." She didn't suspect me. Not yet, but I saw the cracks. Her hands trembling, her confidence leaking away. I left her there, staring at a wrecked career, and felt a cold satisfaction settle in. Then came the calls. I tipped off a few of her old clients anonymously, hinting she'd been unreliable lately, maybe even unstable. Word spread fast. She'd pick up the phone, hopeful, only to slump after a minute. Another rejection. I overheard her once, pleading with some editor. "No, I'm fine, really. It's just a rough patch." But they didn't buy it. The neighbors didn't help. Whispers followed her to the mailbox, kids pointing from across the street. She stopped going out unless she had to. And when she did, she kept her head down, scarf pulled tight like it could hide her shame. I didn't feel sorry for her. She'd chosen Harold's dusty parlor over me, and now she'd live with the fallout. My plan was humming along, but I wanted her to feel it deeper, to know there was no climbing out. By then, I'd moved out, told her I needed space to think, and rented a small place across town. It gave me room to pull the strings without her seeing my hands. The house sale was nearly final. I'd forged her signature on a few papers, easy enough with years of watching her scribble grocery lists. She didn't know yet, thought we were just working things out. I kept up the act when we talked, calm, distant, letting her babble about fixing us. "Maybe counseling," she'd say, eyes red from crying. I'd nod, say, "We'll see," and hang up, already plotting the next move. She didn't deserve my honesty anymore. I turned my attention to her mind. She'd always been a little superstitious, knocking on wood, avoiding black cats, so I leaned into that. I mailed her unmarked packages. A cracked mirror, a dead flower, a photo of Harold's stuffed peacock with no note. She'd text me, frantic, "Mark, someone's messing with me." And I'd reply, "Probably kids," keeping my voice steady. But I knew it was eating at her. One night, I drove by and saw her porch light flickering. She'd rigged it to stay on, scared of the dark now. I added more. Faint knocks on her windows at odd hours, just me tapping and vanishing into the shadows. She started leaving voicemails, rambling about curses and bad energy. I didn't answer, let her stew in it. The money was the real knife. Our joint accounts still had a decent chunk, savings from my coding gigs, her freelance checks. I drained them slow, transferring bits to a trust I'd set up under a shell name. She didn't notice until the card declined at the grocery store. She called me furious, then scared. "Mark, where's the money? Did someone hack us?" I drove over again, looked at the statements with her, feigned shock. "I'll call the bank," I said, knowing they'd find nothing. My tracks were clean. She sat there, hugging herself, while I promised to sort it out. By then, the house buyer had signed, and I had the cash wired to my new account. She was broke, clinging to a life I'd already sold out from under her. I left her that night with a pat on the shoulder, her world shrinking, and felt the weight of my control. She danced with Harold's madness. Now I'd choreograph her fall. The end came fast once the pieces were in place. The house sale closed on a Wednesday. I timed it so she'd be at work. The new owners showed up with a moving truck, and I made sure I was there, watching from my car as Sarah pulled in. She stumbled out, keys in hand, staring at the strangers unloading boxes. "What's going on?" she yelled, voice cracking. The realtor I'd hired, a guy I paid extra to keep my name off it, handed her the eviction notice, cold and legal. "Property's sold, ma'am. You've got till tomorrow." She turned to me, eyes wild, when she spotted me across the street. "Mark, did you do this?" I didn't answer, just drove off, leaving her with a suitcase and a lawn full of questions. I'd saved the best for last. Harold's taxidermy collection, confiscated after the raid, had been sitting in evidence. I called in a favor from a guy I knew, a courier who owed me for fixing his system years back. "Deliver it to this address," I said, handing him Sarah's motel info. A few days later, I got the report. Dozens of boxes dumped at her door. No labels, just those glassy-eyed animals staring up at her. She'd opened them alone, screaming loud enough to draw a crowd. Neighbors gawking as she shoved foxes and owls into the dumpster, sobbing. I wasn't there, but I pictured it clear as day. Her in that dingy lot, surrounded by the ghosts of her betrayal, no one to help. I moved to Portland a week later. New job, new apartment, a clean slate. Harold was still locked up. Heard his health was failing, no surprise, and Sarah faded into whatever hole she'd crawled to. The motel clerk said she'd checked out, left no forwarding address. I kept one thing. That blurry photo of her in the corset, Harold's hand on her hip. Not for sentiment, it's a reminder. She took our life and twisted it into something grotesque with that old man, chasing his trinkets and his rotting fantasies. I didn't just take it back. I burned it down, piece by piece, until she had nothing. People might call it cruel, but I call it justice. Maple Street's a memory now, and I sleep fine knowing she'll never forget what she lost, or what I made her pay. Portland felt like a different planet after Maple Street. Crisp air, gray skies, a hum of strangers who didn't know my name or my story. I'd landed a better gig, coding for a startup downtown, and my apartment overlooked the river, all glass and steel, nothing like that creaky old house. At first, I thought I'd left it all behind. Sarah, Harold, the whole twisted mess. I'd sip coffee on my balcony, watch the water ripple, and tell myself I'd won. She'd betrayed me in the strangest way, trading our quiet life for that old man's dusty parlor and his bizarre games, and I'd made her pay. The photo of her in that corset sat in a locked drawer, a trophy I rarely touched but couldn't toss. Victory, though, has a funny way of echoing. I'd get these flashes, her face when the house sold, the sound of her voice cracking over the phone about her ruined art. I didn't feel bad, not exactly, but it stuck with me. Nights were the worst. I'd lie awake, replaying how I'd unraveled her. Mothballs, the virus, those boxes of Harold's animals. It wasn't guilt gnawing at me. It was something colder, like I'd carved out a piece of myself to finish it. I'd wanted her to suffer, and she had, broke, alone, a pariah. But I hadn't expected the silence after. No calls, no letters, just a void where she used to be. I'd check the gossip sites sometimes, see if Maple Street still buzzed about the illustrator and the taxidermy guy. But it had faded. People move on. I should have too, but part of me kept listening for her footsteps, like she'd show up and demand I explain. She never did. Then I heard from a mutual friend, Tom, a guy we'd known since college. He'd run into her at a gas station an hour outside Portland. Said she looked rough, skinny, jumpy, like she hadn't slept in weeks. He told me over beers one night. She'd been pumping gas into a beat-up sedan, her hair greasy, wearing a coat too big for her. Tom asked how she was, and she'd muttered something about starting over, then drove off without another word. "She smelled like mothballs, man," he added, raising an eyebrow. I smirked into my glass, didn't tell him why. It was my mark still on her months later. Knowing she was out there, fraying at the edges, should have felt good, and it did mostly, but it also stirred something restless in me. I'd broken her, sure, but I wasn't done watching the pieces fall. A year into Portland, I thought I'd settled. Work kept me busy. I'd made a few acquaintances. Nothing deep, just enough to fill the hours. But Sarah lingered, a ghost I couldn't shake. I'd catch myself sniffing the air sometimes, half expecting that musty scent, or staring at women with auburn hair, wondering if it was her. Then came the letter. No return address, just my name in her shaky handwriting, postmarked from some nowhere town in Idaho. I held it for an hour before opening it, my pulse ticking up. Inside was a single page. Mark, I know it was you. The house, the money, those things at the motel. I don't blame you. I messed up. I'm sorry. That was it. No plea, no fight, just those flat words. I read it twice, then burned it in the sink, watching the ash curl. It should have been the end, but it lit a spark. I needed to know where she was, how far she'd fallen. I called Tom, asked if he'd heard more. He hadn't, but he gave me the gas station's town, some spec called Milton. I dug online, found a motel there, the kind with flickering neon and peeling paint. On a whim, I drove out one weekend, for hours through pine forests and empty roads. I didn't plan to confront her, just look. The motel clerk, a bored kid with acne, said yeah, a woman matching her description worked nights, cleaning rooms. I waited in my car across the street, and at dusk, there she was. Sarah, thinner than ever, pushing a cart of towels, her eyes hollow. She didn't see me, didn't even glance up, just shuffled along like a shadow of herself. That smell, mothballs, hit me when the wind shifted, faint but unmistakable. I branded her and it stuck. Driving back, I felt this mix of triumph and unease. She was alive, barely, scraping by in a nowhere life, and I'd put her there. But seeing her like that, small, broken, didn't fill me up like I'd thought. It hollowed me out instead. I stopped at a diner halfway home, sat with a cold coffee, and wondered if I'd gone too far. Not for her sake, hers stopped mattering when she chose Harold, but for mine. I'd built this revenge to reclaim control, to punish her for turning our marriage into some grotesque play with that old man. It worked. She was nothing now. So why didn't it settle? Why did I keep seeing those glass-eyed animals in my dreams, watching me like they knew something I didn't? Back in Portland, I tried to let it go. Sarah's letter, her motel existence. It was closure, I told myself. I threw out the corset photo, tired of its weight, and focused on the present. Coding, hiking, a life without her shadow. But fate's got a cruel streak. 6 months later, Tom called again, voice low. Harold's gone, he said. Heart gave out in jail. Thought you'd want to know. I didn't feel much relief, maybe, that the old man's chapter was shut. Then Tom added, Sarah showed up at his hearing, right before. Looked like a wreck, tried to speak for him. They wouldn't let her. I hung up, picturing her there, clinging to the last shred of her twisted fairy tale. It sparked one final move. I tracked her down again, not hard, Milton's small. She'd moved from the motel to a trailer park nearby, a rusty box on cinder blocks. I didn't go myself this time. I hired a guy, a PI I'd used before, to scope it out. He sent photos. Sarah sitting on a plastic chair outside, staring at nothing, a stuffed bird, some cheap knockoff, on the steps beside her. She talks to it sometimes, the PI wrote. Calls it Sir Harold. Smells like an old attic. I laughed, bitter and sharp, at how she'd clung to that madness. Then I gave him one last job. I kept a stash of mothballs, leftovers from the early days of my plan. Scatter them around her place, I said. Make it quiet. He did, snuck in at night, sprinkled them under her trailer, in the weeds, a final twist of the knife. Weeks later, the PI checked back. She'd left Milton, trailer abandoned, bird gone. No one knew where, maybe another town, maybe nowhere. The mothballs were still there, he said, scattered like confetti. I didn't chase her after that. She'd vanish into the world, a wraith marked by my hand, and that was enough. Harold was dead, Sarah was a shell, and I was free, or as free as I'd get. I sold the Portland place last month, moved south to Bend, started fresh again. The echoes faded, the dreams stopped. I don't wonder about her anymore. She chose her path, danced with that old man's ghosts, and I made sure it cost her everything. If there's a lesson, it's this: betray me, and I'll bury you in ways you can't imagine. I sleep fine now, and that's all that matters. Bend was quieter than Portland. a mountain town with pine-scented air and a slower pulse. I picked it for that, less noise, fewer ghosts. My new place was a cabin just outside town, cedar walls and a wood stove, surrounded by trees that swallowed the past. The startup let me work remote, so I spent days coding by a window, watching deer wander through the snow. Nights, I'd sit by the fire, a beer in hand, and feel the weight of Maple Street lift, bit by bit. Sarah and Harold were gone, him in the ground, her lost to some nowhere place, and I'd convinced myself I'd moved on. No more photos, no more letters, just a clean break. I even started hiking, long trails that burned the restlessness out of me. Life felt simple again, or close to it. But simplicity's a lie when you've done what I have. I'd catch myself thinking about her, not with pity but curiosity. Where had she landed after Milton? Was she still clutching that fake bird, whispering to it like it was Harold? The PI's last report, mothballs around her trailer, her vanishing, sat in my mind like a bookmark I couldn't pull out. I didn't regret it, not really. She turned our marriage into a bizarre play, chasing that old man's trinkets and his dusty fantasies, and I'd made her pay in ways that fit the crime. The mothballs, the animals, the ruined career, it was justice, my kind, tailored to her betrayal. Still, I'd check my lock some nights, half expecting her shadow at the door. She never came, but the thought lingered, a thread I couldn't quite cut. Then I met Claire. She worked at the gear shop in town. Tall, freckled, with a laugh that cut through my guarded edges. We talk when I bought hiking stuff, small things at first. Weather, trails, the best coffee spots. She didn't pry, didn't ask about the ring I'd stopped wearing. And I liked that. One day, she invited me to a group hike, her friends, a campfire after. I went, surprised how easy it felt to sit there, swapping stories, feeling human again. Claire's presence was steady, warm. Nothing like Sarah's restless spark. I didn't tell her about Maple Street. Not yet. But I started thinking maybe I could build something new. The past wasn't gone, but it was fading until it wasn't. It was late spring when the package arrived. No return address, just my name scratched in black ink, postmarked from Boise. I stood on my porch, turning it over. A small, heavy box, tape peeling at the edges. My gut knew before my head caught up. Sarah. I brought it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and stared at it like it might move. Part of me wanted to chuck it into the woods unopened, but I couldn't. I grabbed a knife, slid it open, and there it was. A taxidermied squirrel, glass eyes glinting, posed on a tiny branch. No note, no explanation, just that creepy little thing staring up at me. The smell hit next. Mothballs, faint but sharp, like a slap from the past. I dropped the lid, stepped back, my heart hammering. She'd found me. How, I didn't know. New address, new town, I'd covered my tracks. But there it was, proof she wasn't gone. I paced the cabin, mind racing. Was it a taunt? An apology? Revenge of her own? I pictured her scavenging that squirrel from some junk shop, packing it with those mothballs to twist the knife back at me. I'd buried her in that scent, in Harold's madness, and now she was throwing it in my face. I dumped the thing in the trash, scrubbed my hands, but the smell clung, seeping into the walls. That night, I barely slept. The squirrel's eyes burned into my skull. Claire called, asked if I wanted to grab dinner, but I brushed her off. Couldn't let her see me rattled. The next day, I called the PI again. Find her, I said, voice tight. Boise, start there. He grumbled about the hassle but took the job. 2 weeks later, he had something. A sighting at a flea market. A woman matching her description selling oddities. Stuffed animals, old costumes, junk from her past. Looked half crazy, he said. Thin, muttering. Smelled like a museum. She'd set up a table, he told me, with a sign. Harold's Treasures. I hung up, picturing her there, clinging to that wreckage like it was treasure. It wasn't enough to let her fade anymore. She'd reached out, poked the bear, and I couldn't ignore it. I didn't want her back in my life. I wanted her gone. For good this time, whatever that meant. I didn't tell Claire about the squirrel or Sarah, or any of it. She didn't need to know the man I'd been on Maple Street, the one who'd burned a life to ash. But that box lit a fire I thought I'd doused. I drove to Boise myself. 5 hours, straight through, no stops. Telling Claire it was a work thing. The flea market was a sprawl of tents and tables, air thick with dust and grilled meat. I found her near the back, hunched over a folding table littered with junk. A cracked teacup, a feathered hat, and yes, more stuffed critters. Mice, a rabbit, all staring blankly. She didn't see me at first, too busy haggling with some guy over a moth-eaten shawl. She was gaunt, hair stringy, her coat patched with duct tape. That smell hung around her, a cloud of decay and memory. I watched for an hour, hidden behind a stack of crates. She'd smile at customers, a cracked, hollow thing, and mutter to herself when they left. Bits of old songs, Harold's name. The sign, Harold's Treasures, was propped up with a rock, scribbled in marker. It hit me then. She wasn't fighting back with that squirrel. She was lost in it, trapped in the world she'd chosen, the one I'd turned into her prison. I'd won long ago, and she didn't even know it. Still, I couldn't leave it there. I waited till dusk, till she packed up, then slipped a note under her table's edge. Leave me alone or I'll finish it. No signature, she'd know. I drove back to Bend, hands steady on the wheel, telling myself it was over. A month later, the PI checked again. Her table was gone. The market vendor said she'd stopped showing up. Someone found her coat in a dumpster, mothballs spilling from the pockets, but no sign of her. Maybe she'd moved on, maybe she'd broken completely. I didn't care as long as she stayed out of my orbit. Back in Bend, I burned the squirrel in the wood stove, watched the flames eat it, the glass eyes popping in the heat. Claire noticed I'd been off, asked if I was okay. I kissed her forehead, said, "Just tired," and meant it. Sarah's last jab had landed, but it didn't stick. I'd built something new here, a life, a chance, and she couldn't touch it. The past was ash now, and I was done tending the fire. Bend became my refuge, a place where the mountains swallowed my past and spat out something resembling peace. Claire and I grew closer, nothing rushed, just steady. She'd moved in after a year, her hiking boots by the door, her sketches of wildflowers pinned to the fridge. I told her bits of the truth. A marriage that ended badly, a wife who'd drifted away. I left out the taxidermy, the mothballs, the calculated ruin. I didn't want her looking at me like I was a stranger. She didn't push, just nodded and squeezed my hand. And that was enough. Work stayed good. The cabin felt like home, and I started thinking maybe I'd outrun it all. Sarah's squirrel was ashes, her note a faded threat, and Harold was a name I barely remembered. Time, I figured, would bury the rest. But time's a tricky thing. It doesn't erase, it compresses. I'd be fine for months, then catch a whiff of something musty in a thrift store and freeze, heart thudding, expecting her around the corner. Or I'd wake from dreams where those glass-eyed animals lined my walls, watching me code, their stillness louder than any sound. Claire noticed the rough nights, asked once if I had old ghosts. I laughed it off, just bad coffee. But she wasn't wrong. I checked the locks more than I needed to, scanned the mail for her shaky scrawl. Nothing came, though. Boise was the last I'd heard of her. That flea market table her final stage, and I told myself she'd burned out somewhere, a candle snuffed by her own choices. My revenge had worked too well, maybe, and I tried to let it settle. Then Claire got curious. She found an old Maple Street photo in a box I'd forgotten to toss. Me and Sarah, smiling at a barbecue years before Harold. "She's pretty," Claire said, holding it up. "What happened?" I shrugged, kept it vague. People change. But she kept it on the counter like a bookmark she'd returned to, and I didn't like that. It stirred things I'd buried. The sting of Sarah's laughter with Harold, the feel of mothballs in my palm as I planted them. I burned the photo that night while Claire slept, told her later it got lost. She frowned but let it go. I didn't want her digging, didn't want my clean slate scratched up. Bend was mine now, and I'd fight to keep it that way. 3 years in Bend, and I thought I'd built something solid, Claire, the cabin, a rhythm I could trust. But cracks show up when you least expect them. Started with a call from Tom, out of the blue. "Found something you might want to see," he said, voice odd. He'd been clearing his attic, stumbled on a box of old Maple Street stuff. Letters, photos, junk from our college crew. One was a note from Sarah, dated a month after the house sold, addressed to me but never sent. Tom read it over the phone. "Mark, I know you hate me. I don't blame you. I lost myself with him and you made me pay. I just want you to know I'm trying to be better." He paused. She drew a little bird on it, stuffed looking. "Weird. Huh." I told him to trash it. Hung up, but it stuck like burrs in my skin. I didn't tell Claire. She'd started asking more gentle stuff like why I never talked about my ex, why I flinched at antique shops. I dodged, changed the subject, but she was sharp, piecing things together. Then the dreams got worse. Not just animals now. Sarah, too, standing in that corset, mothballs raining around her, saying, "You finished it, didn't you?" I'd wake soaked, Claire's hand on my shoulder, her eyes worried. "You're scaring me," she said one morning, voice soft but firm. "What's in your head?" Couldn't answer, not fully. How do you explain turning someone into a ghost, watching them haunt themselves, and still feeling the weight? I'd wanted Sarah to suffer for what she did with Harold, for twisting our life into that grotesque farce. And she had. But now I wondered, had I carved too deep, left a mark on myself I couldn't see? Claire pushed me to a counselor, her idea, not mine. I went once, sat in a beige room with a guy who smelled like mints, and lied through my teeth. "Rough divorce," I said. "Over it now." He nodded, scribbled notes, but I didn't go back. Truth was, I didn't regret the revenge, the house, the money those animals dumped at her door. It fit her crime, a betrayal so strange it demanded something crueler than words. What I didn't expect was this shadow it left, this quiet hum in my bones. Claire stayed patient, but I saw her watching me closer, like she sensed the man who'd burned a life down wasn't fully gone. I loved her, wanted this to work, but Sarah's echo kept tapping at the edges, and I didn't know how to silence it. Came to a head last fall. Claire and I were good, engaged, even a small ring she picked herself, no fuss. We'd planned a trip, a week in the Cascades, when Tom called again. "She's dead," he said, blunt as a hammer. "Sarah. Found her in a trailer up north, overdose, they think. Been gone a while." I sat there, phone heavy, while Claire chopped carrots in the kitchen. Tom kept talking. Cops said she'd been alone, surrounded by junk. Old costumes, a few stuffed animals, mothballs everywhere. Like she couldn't let it go, he said. I thanked him, hung up, and stared at the wall. Dead. The word didn't land right. Not relief, not sadness, just a blank space where she used to be. I told Claire that night, kept it simple. My ex passed. Old news. She hugged me, asked if I was okay, and I nodded, but I wasn't sure. Later, I drove out alone, found a quiet spot by the river, and sat with it. Sarah was gone, the end I'd half expected but never planned. I'd wanted her broken, not finished, but maybe I'd pushed her there. Mothballs, ruin, that note in Boise. Her betrayal with Harold had been bizarre. A slap to everything we'd built, and I'd answered with a sledgehammer. She'd danced with his ghosts, and I'd made her live with them, till they swallowed her whole. I didn't feel guilty. She chose her path, but I felt something, a hollow ache, like I'd lost a piece of myself in the wreckage I'd made. Back home, Claire was asleep, the cabin warm and still. I stood by the window watching snow dust the trees and saw my reflection. Older, harder, a man who'd won but paid for it. I'd buried Sarah's strange infidelity with a revenge that matched it, cruel and precise. And now it was done. No more packages. No more dreams. Just me and what I'd built here. I crawled into bed, pulled Claire close, and let her warmth anchor me. The past was a mirror I'd shattered, its pieces scattered across years and miles. I'd live with the cuts, but I wouldn't look back. Bend was mine, Claire was mine, and Sarah, whatever she'd been, was finally truly gone.